Hello, my name is Matt Shar, and today I'm going to explain how the reasoning used by the defense attorneys in the O.J. Simpson trial can be used as an analogy to argue in favor of the resurrection of Jesus and the other miracles reported in the New Testament. Before we get started, O.J. was found innocent by a jury of his peers, and I am in no way trying to offer an opinion on the verdict. It is also not necessary to use the O.J. trial specifically for this argument to work. I just think that it helps to use an example that people are familiar with when we use analogies in our arguments. On the night of June 12, 1994, O.J. Simpson's estranged wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman were murdered. After a brief investigation, O.J. was arrested, and the police stated that they were in possession of clear and convincing evidence that O.J. was responsible. After his trial started, O.J.'s defense attorneys looked into the background of the lead detective on the case, a man named Mark Furman. What they found shocked everyone. The defense located an audio tape of Mark Furman bragging about committing unspeakable acts of racism, brutality, and other such police misconduct against African Americans specifically. He also lied under oath about his past use of racial slurs and invoked the Fifth Amendment when asked if he manufactured or planted any evidence to frame O.J. Understandably, this led the defense to consider the hypothesis that O.J. was framed by the police. The defense was able to successfully argue that every piece of evidence could be explained by the O.J. was framed hypothesis, and that there were good reasons to think that Mark Furman may have planted the evidence. This led to O.J. being acquitted on all charges. Keep in mind that a defense attorney arguing that their client was framed means they are admitting that the evidence does point to their client's guilt. They are just explaining the existence of the evidence in a way that maintains their client's innocence. This is similar to how a student claiming, "My dog ate my homework," admits that their homework is missing, but tries to explain why they do not have their homework in a way that maintains their innocence. I imagine you are wondering what this has to do with the resurrection and other miracles recorded in the New Testament. Well, when we look at the historical record, there are certain historical data points surrounding the origin of the Christian faith that are so strongly evidenced they are accepted by an almost unanimous consensus of scholars of history. This includes scholars from a wide variety of theological perspectives, including atheists, Jewish people, and many others. All of the quotes in the following slides are examples of world-renowned, non-Christian scholars who affirm the following data. First, Jesus had a 3-year ministry all around the nation of Israel. During his ministry, he amazed large crowds by performing deeds that himself and countless others believed to be miracles. He was believed to have performed healings from debilitating physical and mental disorders, miraculous creation of food, and other nature miracles.
Whatever you think about the philosophical possibility of miracles of healing, it's clear that Jesus was widely reputed to have done them. Let me also add that he was known to have performed other miracles not associated with healing physical ailments, though dealing still with the natural world. For example, multiplying loaves, walking on water, stilling the storm. Such miracles, too, are attested in multiple sources. We note that Jesus, as exorcist, healer, even to the point of raising the dead, and miracle worker, is one of the strongest, most ubiquitous, and most variously attested depictions in the Gospels. All strata of this material, Mark, John, M traditions, L traditions, and Q, make this claim. This sort of independent, multiple attestation supports arguments for the antiquity of a given tradition, implying that its source must lie prior to its later manifold expressions, perhaps in the mission of Jesus himself.
Second, Jesus died by crucifixion.
Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable.
Third, after Jesus' death, several of his best friends, closest disciples, and formerly skeptical family members had experiences that they sincerely believed were appearances of Jesus alive from the dead.
It is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. We know some of these believers by name. One of them, the Apostle Paul, claims quite plainly to have seen Jesus alive after his death. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ.
Fourth, Saul of Tarsus was a socially prominent Jewish Pharisee who was leading a campaign of violent persecution against the Christians because he believed them to be teaching idolatry. Then, he had an experience that he so sincerely believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him, he gave up his comfortable life in Judaism and became the Christian missionary we know as the Apostle Paul.
Before Paul became an apostle, he was Christ's sworn enemy, a violent persecutor of his followers. As a faithful Jew, Paul considered the Christian claim that Jesus was the Messiah deeply blasphemous, and so Paul tried to destroy the Christian faith, until he converted to it. But what drove his change of heart? He believed he saw Christ alive years after his death on the cross. Paul's experience of the resurrection completely revolutionized his thinking, turning him from being a violent persecutor of the Christian faith to being its most forceful and successful advocate.
Fifth, Paul went on missionary journeys to multiple major cities across the Roman Empire and was successful in convincing numerous people to become Christians. Throughout his undisputed letters, Paul credits his success to his having performed numerous miracles in the presence of the people receiving his letters.
Paul began an apostolic mission. Paul understood his mission field to be from just north of Palestine all the way over to Illyricum. He established churches in Syria, Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Achaia. So he's going one place to another in order to make converts among the Gentiles. How did he persuade anybody? It is interesting that what Paul says is that he convinced them by doing miracles. We don't know what he means, but presumably his readers know what he's talking about, because they were the ones there. We are here, of course, referring only to what mainstream consensus considers the 7 authentic letters of Paul: 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Romans, and maybe Philemon.
Sixth, there were multiple government-sponsored mass executions of Christians between 64 AD and 313 AD. Despite this fact, the number of Christians in the Roman Empire increased to several million during this time. The Church Fathers are unanimous in citing widespread miracles as the primary explanation for the growth of the Christian movement.
The typical scholarly number is that by the year 300 AD, there are 5 or 6 million Christians in the world. You can read through our early Christian sources of all kinds, whether they are legends, letters church leaders write, treatises, or essays, and they all say, whenever they talk about people converting, it is always in relationship to miracles.
This historical data shows that an absolutely enormous number of people risked their lives and eternal destinies to follow Jesus because they honestly believed they either witnessed or performed numerous miracles. The fact that all of these people believed they either witnessed or performed numerous miracles does not automatically mean the miracles are true. However, we should always try to seek the best explanation for any given historical data. In this instance, the data to be explained is the fact that these people genuinely believe they witnessed numerous miracles. Therefore, we have 2 possible explanations for the data.
1. They actually witnessed numerous miracles. Or 2. They saw something other than miracles that they mistakenly believed were miracles.
Non-Christian scholars throughout history have proposed a variety of hypotheses to explain the data without affirming the truth of the miracles. In every case, their hypotheses will boil down to the assumption that the witnesses to these events were mentally incompetent in one way or another. The most common argument they use is that everyone was just hallucinating. In the same way that O.J.'s defense, arguing that he was framed by the police, was an admission that the evidence pointed to his guilt, but explained the existence of the evidence in a way that maintained his innocence, skeptical scholars, arguing that the witnesses were mentally incompetent, admits that the witnesses did believe they witnessed miracles, but attempts to explain this fact in a way that allows the scholars to deny the truth of the miracles. The basic outline of the skeptic's argument against the truth of the miracles is stated in the following way.
Historians can only establish on the basis of surviving evidence what probably happened in the past, and by definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence, or else they're not a miracle. This creates the dilemma for the historian and is the reason why historians cannot prove Jesus was raised from the dead. Historians, by their very nature, establish what most probably happened in the past, but a miracle, by its definition, is the least probable occurrence in the past. The least probable occurrence cannot be most probable. This is the problem with the resurrection. Even if it happened, it defies imagination and cannot be accepted as a historically proven event.
Once miracles are ruled out as a potential explanation, the scholar will cite the fact that the first Christians were convinced that they witnessed miracles as the evidence that they must have been mentally incompetent in some way. No independent evidence is ever offered to suggest that the witnesses were mentally incompetent. It is just assumed simply because they believe they witnessed miracles. As an example, please listen to 2 of the most famous scholars of New Testament studies in the world, both of whom are atheists.
It is not at all implausible that after his death, Jesus was experienced in a vision by one or more of his disciples. That explains the appearances without appealing to miracles. Let me give you a second, rather crazy idea. I'm not claiming this is what happened, but it does strike me as interesting. In the Syriac tradition, Jesus was allegedly known to have a twin brother, Didymus Judas Thomas. Looked just like him. Here's the hypothesis. A few weeks after the resurrection, somebody from a distance saw Judas Didymus Thomas and said, "There's Jesus!" And he disappeared. A couple of days later, someone else saw him. "There's Jesus again." People thought they saw Jesus. He died. He must have been raised from the dead. Is that plausible? Not really. Is it more plausible than a resurrection? Yes. Any historical explanation is more plausible than the resurrection because the resurrection is a miracle and historians cannot prove miracles.
Cognitive dissonance is when you start to have two beliefs that conflict with each other. And this actually creates an agitating, discomforting state. And you struggle to get out of this state by reconciling or picking one side of the contradiction or finding a way to harmonize them. If you're schizotypal, if you're prone to hallucinations, as Paul clearly was, he talks about having visions and revelations all the time, having conversations with Jesus. The way out, and we know this from scientific studies, the way out of that is to hallucinate something that resolves the contradiction. When we turn to Paul's epistles, we find that the earliest Christians were hallucinating on a regular basis, entering ecstatic trances and prophesying and having visions and relaying the communications of spirits and speaking in tongues. So much, in fact, that Paul had to set up rules of order to control the din, and he says outsiders would think they were lunatics if they behaved out of order. That tells me the first Christians were schizotypal.
In the law it is written, "By people of strange tongues, and by the lips of foreigners will I speak to this people, and even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord." Thus, tongues are a sign, not for believers, but for unbelievers. Paul clearly states that the gift of tongues is a fulfillment of prophecy, in which God promises that he will empower Gentiles to overcome the language barrier and speak to the Jewish people on his behalf. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" They challenged Jesus to prophesy by asking him to tell them who struck him while he was blindfolded. This shows that at least one aspect of the gift of prophecy was the ability to know things that one could not have known without God informing them. If, therefore, the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you are out of your minds? But if all prophesy, and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so, falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. Paul is pointing out that an outsider observing everyone simultaneously speaking a variety of different languages would seem like insanity. However, he precedes and follows this statement by instructing them to use their miraculous gifts of tongues and prophecy to prove to outsiders that the Christian God is the true God. This would make no sense if speaking in tongues and prophesying was a natural phenomenon being brought on by a schizotypal hallucinatory episode.
Dr. Ehrman explicitly states that according to his methodology, a miracle can never be proven historically. He then affirms the hallucination hypothesis because he feels that it is the best non-miraculous explanation. He even admits that he would be willing to accept the ridiculous evil twin hypothesis before he would accept the resurrection of Jesus, simply because the resurrection is a miracle. Then, Dr. Carrier argues that the first disciples who believed they saw the resurrected Jesus, Paul, and the first generations of Christians must have had schizotypal personality disorder, simply because they all had experiences that they interpreted to be miracles. The problem with this kind of reasoning is that it assesses the probability of a miracle occurring on the assumption that only natural forces are operative in the world. This reasoning also uses any historical evidence that the miracles did happen as the evidence that the people proclaiming the miracles must have been hallucinating, thereby ruling out the possibility of identifying a miracle as a real historical event. If they were reasoning properly, they would set aside their theological opinions, then determine the best explanation for the evidence. If miracles actually happening was the best explanation, they could either leave the cause an open question, or make the theological inference to God as the cause. However, they cannot allow for the possibility of miracles, because it is obvious that the miracles being true perfectly explains the data, and without their theological presupposition of naturalism, there is no reason to think that any of these people were hallucinating. Clearly, this would leave the atheist in a rather awkward position. In order to illustrate the error in the skeptic's reasoning, please consider the following illustration.
Imagine that Mark Furman did not exist, and OJ's defense attorneys had no evidence at all to suggest that he was framed, but the evidence pointing to his guilt was the same. Then, during the trial, the defense argued that the possibility that OJ is guilty should be ruled out as a potential explanation for any evidence. Then, whenever evidence of his guilt was presented, the defense argued that the evidence proves that he must have been framed. Then, when asked for independent evidence that OJ was framed, the defense simply cited the evidence of his guilt with the caveat that because his innocence should be assumed, it must be the case that he was framed.
If you would not accept that one should assume OJ was framed without independent evidence, then you should not accept that the first Christians were mentally incompetent without independent evidence. Mark Fuhrman was an incredibly racist, dishonest, and corrupt police officer at a time when OJ was an extremely successful and widely respected African-American man. Therefore, OJ's lawyers had independent reasons to think that Mark Fuhrman may have wanted to frame OJ. However, there is no independent evidence at all to suggest that the witnesses to the miracles reported in the New Testament and writings of the early church fathers were mentally incompetent in any way. Therefore, we are perfectly reasonable in accepting that their testimony to having witnessed miracles is reliable. Then, making the theological inference that the Christian God exists and has revealed himself through our Lord Jesus Christ. In closing, if our skeptical friends mistakenly believe that we take it on blind faith that the miracles recorded in the New Testament are true, then we should inform them that even the hardest atheist scholars almost unanimously affirm the fact that the first several generations of Christians genuinely believed they witnessed numerous miracles. Then, we should ask them if they have any reason to think that the witnesses were mentally incompetent. If not, we should explain that there is no reason to doubt the truth of the Christian faith. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.